Be welcome to our second day of works for our conference for lifelong learning. And thank you for being here. Before starting with our two keynote conferences, let me tell you that in Mexico we celebrate Mother's Day on May the 10th. That is why we would like to take a moment to congratulate all the mothers that are present here on their day. Once we started with the conferences, exit and entrance would be in the back part of the room. In the event, in the case if the train is passing by, we are going to have a pause. We will ask you to put your mobile devices on silence mode so we can have a better communication and development in our presentations. Today, we are going to have two keynote conferences, and that would be the conclusion of this encounter. We will have 20 minutes for Q&A after the ending of each keynote conferences. And as you know, the microphone will be in the middle of the room, so you can be online to ask your questions. We are about to start with Dr. Raúl Valdés-Cotera conferences. Sergio Cárdenas, Crefal director, has the floor to introduce his resume. Good morning. Good morning. If you were here with us yesterday, you have realized that we had a great discussion, and this was our intent. That's why we are very glad, because the weather has been nice and we were able to take our pictures, and we are happy for that. We had a great beginning. The second day is going to be the same for us. If it was a religious situation, it is a sacrilege to work on Mother's Day, especially in Mexico. I would like to congratulate the mothers on their day and for being here so early. Once again, thank you for being with me. Raúl Valdés-Cotera is with us, and one of the first persons that I had a conversation with after my appointment was with him. We have a long telephone conversation about how good it is to have this type of dialogues and to be part of the Crefal. So this activity stemmed out from that first conversation. Thank you so much for that, Doctor. And we have work hard on developing not only a personal but also a professional relationship, and this has been very important for Crefal's development. Raúl Valdés is the current coordinator for the Unesco program for the Lifelong Learning Program and the director of the Lifelong Learning Program at Unesco. We are trying to promote this program as well in Crefal. He has a master's degree in business administration and a PhD in education. For 10 years, he has been working in international organizations in lifelong learning issues as well as in adult learning. He has created the glossary for adults for Latin America and the Caribbean in 2013. And the glossary for lifelong learning, and he was publisher with J. Young and the public policy analysis for adults and young, and between Mexico and Brazil. One of these papers is going to be translated into Spanish, and we are happy for that. I would like to stand out that Raúl is at home, because quite often when we have meetings here, we will have to wait because everybody wants to hug him. And this is a an acknowledgement for his great performance at Crefal. He had a great influence in all the training at Crefal. And the idea is to contribute with the feedback of all these experts. He is an influencer in the field of education and in the issue of lifelong learning. So now you have the floor.
Buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning to all of you. It's very difficult for me not to feel moved after Sergio's word. I'm in a place where I find a lot of people with whom I have a lot of discussions. And we keep on with our endless discussion. And now I see a different option for lifelong learning in Latin America for the momentum that we are living, because we are looking forward to have a renewed Crefal. And I am not saying that because I am here, because in the international environment they are questioning about what is happening at Crefal in Mexico. We have a strong team open to discussions, open to defend not only the institutionality of this agency, but also to find failures and in order to find new knowledge, new voices, to learn about what is happening in the field of adult education. As you all know, Latin America has been the spearhead of international adult education. The proposals emerged in this region have been well welcomed in other parts of the world. I want to tell you that at the UNESCO Institute, when we think about experts, we always find out Latin American people. There are a lot of researchers working in adult education, in the adult education field in Latin America. Something interesting, when I was about designing my dissertation work for PhD, we have been learning during our life. I've been in different sectors. I studied business, then psychology, psychoanalysis. Then I had a PhD in education. So the idea for me was to have a dissertation, a thesis on lifelong learning issues. And I wanted, and my mentor was a specialist on adult learning. So this term has always been linked to its development in Europe. And because we avoid the influence of Europe, sometimes this term is not well received. However, I was persistent. I tried to move in the international arena along with the UNESCO's Institute because they focus on this issue. In UNESCO, they have 5 institutes. In Hamburg, they have the Institute for Lifelong Learning. And their focus has been in adult education. But in the last 5 years, they opened this new option in the issue of lifelong learning. However, in the issue of literacy and adult education, those are their main focus. I'm always afraid of not matching the level of the keynote speakers that were very relevant and interesting. I learned a lot of them. I would like to talk to you about the evolution of the concept of lifelong learning. I would like to talk about what its role during the 2030 agenda, because for the first time, this issue is embedded in international documents as a principle that organizes the educational system. Thirdly, to talk about some inconsistencies that we have noticed during the lifelong learning process in the 2030 agenda. And fourth, to talk about some practical cases in some countries. We have noticed that there is a lot of academic debate regarding this and other concepts. It is difficult to find how it can be implemented in the practice. Does it really have a real sense in the life of the people? And I would like to share with you some proposals. And I will start briefly with the Unesco's concept. I think that the lifelong learning term has been coined mainly by the UNESCO. And I am not referring only to the 70s report, but since its beginning, always with a humanistic, equitative approach since its creation at UNESCO. Using different terms, they always put the focus on this term. But there is a landmark moment with the Faure report 20 years later, as Dr. Alan Tocket mentioned. Seems to be that every 20 years there is a redefinition of the concept. Then we have Lord's report. The concept is embedded in the Declaration for Education for All in 97 and Hamburgo's Declaration. This is the 5th International Conference for Adult Education, at the 6th Conference in the Berlin Declaration, and lastly, in the Inchos Declaration and the Framework for Action for Education in the 2030 Agenda. But UNESCO is not the only international entity that has addressed the issue, because the European Council promotes ongoing education foundations for an education, long life education, before the 4th report. The basis, the essence on 1976 is an entity that has coined this term as well. And the lifelong term learning term appears for the first time in 1976, a strategy for lifelong learning. And almost at the same time as the Lord Report was launched, the lifelong learning term appears, but for all of us, for all. The European Union has a lot of influence, mainly in the second memorandum for lifelong learning that defines the European policy. It is a dialogue that address the issue on how lifelong learning can benefit the European Union during the 90s and the times in which skills, abilities become the core of the lifelong learning issue. The World Bank has used the term as well in the global economy of knowledge. We could have one day session for all these terms, because each one of them has its own specificities and their own purpose to understand the goals for lifelong learning, which are the subjects of this and what is the line and their objectives. However, I'm going to refer only to two of these terms because I think that they are very representative. The Fraude report, it's a report that you can read in half an hour and it's going to worthwhile the time. I recommend it to you because it presents the concept of learning society. Yes, learning is an individual process. However, in this report, they present this as a possibility to have a community learning process. And it invites the countries to reorganize their educational structures with two premises. Every agency is an education provider, and they all take advantage of opportunities provided by a city of learning. This is a clear influence of the 60s. Freire's influence, Ivan Neely's influence in Cuernavaca, Eric Fromm's influence. There is a whole body of knowledge to let us know that schools are not enough, but that there are other entities that allow the society to integrate into education, and that are more vendors than those that we have thought in the educational process. And this is a momentum that includes many different lines of thought, and it becomes the spearhead of the 70s. For different political situations, after 20 years, nothing happens, seems to be. However, things were happening. But in a different historical moment, in the 90s, there is another report created by Unesco with a set of experts. Delors was the president of the European Union at that time. He was Minister of Education in France, and he calls up people from different parts of the world, from different arenas, to discuss about this concept. He invites the Ministry of Education in Portugal, the Mexican sociologist is present as well, and people, personalities from different and experts. But we notice a shift, a change in the report that responds to a need to have an economic improvement in the region. The European community will be the main entity for economic development. But it proposes similar elements to the Delors report. Lifelong learning is the heartbeat of the society. Learning is there, consciously or unconsciously. It happens there. You can organize processes or just allow them to happen. However, life and learning are united since the very beginning and until the end of the life. Lifelong learning is linked to the society's learning that provides you a lot of opportunities to learn both in school and the economic, social, and cultural life. School is an additional element within the learning process that is given in different fields. Delors says that it's necessary to have more contribution and more relationship between the industry, the family, NGOs, and so forth. It is not only the duty and responsibility of the Ministry of Education. There are other stakeholders that are part of these processes. Different levels of the government are also involved. But the main question here is how to open or to include all these stakeholders into the process. We have to learn to co-live with others. It's very interesting, the concept of learning to do starts with default. It's like learning by learning how to be learning constantly is an ongoing process. And there are some intents to add up more pillars. There are intents to monitor the lifelong learning process through all these pillars. In Singapore, in Canada, and in Germany itself, they work together with 6 countries using these 6 pillars. It's interestingly enough, but learning to know and learning to do was very easy. It was easy to fulfill all these categories. They had good indicators, but the problem was learn to do and learn to do with others. However, Singapore is working hard and striving forward to being able to think on how to assess and building on what Mr. Benabot was saying yesterday, there are some intents to work on the lifelong learning process, considering all these 6 pillars. I don't know if it's the best, but it's a good intent. Always with this option to open the concept of learning that could go beyond the learning and doing. How this can enrich the life in different environments of the subject. I think that we could talk much more about other terms, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on them. I just want to tell you that UNESCO's Institute proposed the following definition for lifelong learning. That I think that, as any other definition, is alive, is under construction, because when it captures the reality itself escapes from us, and we have to rethink about it. However, lifelong learning is based on the integration of both life and learning. It comprises learning activities for all the people of all ages. Young people, children, adult women, men, elderly people, in all the contexts of life: family, school, community, working place, Crefal's auditorium, libraries, museums, public spaces, through different modalities, through a host of modalities. We have formal, non-formal, and informal learning. And yesterday they talked about these issues, fulfilling a wide variety of demands and needs of learning of the people, any age, any context, any modality. It's in this sense that it differentiates mainly from adult education in its life analysis. Even though I have to tell you that the concept has stemmed out from adult education term, but it's not the same. And now, I leave you with this food for thought. But let's see what lifelong learning education says to us 15 years old. It looks like a Dumas novel. Every 20 years, we see a shift in the concept. And we find out the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. From 2000 to 2015, we have the SDGs and the ALE, stemming out from the SDGs that are positioned independently. And now we have 2 international agendas addressing this subject matter. In the year 2015, and we notice that the progress has been very poor. In the 2015, on September, the Assembly General approves by 137 countries all the SDGs. It contains 17 different goals integrated among them and recognizing the main needs of the country, of the planet. Starting with the issue of poverty, hunger, health, education, gender, work, and so forth. And how they are linked among them. But the core value of the agenda is that puts education into the center of the agenda for the first time as an articulating participant. Goal number 4, specifically, the goal is the following. Is education. Reads as follows. The goal is to ensure an inclusive education, equitative with quality, to promote learning opportunities for long life education. And the concept appears there again, but with another term included there, quality, because the previous agenda showed that access is not enough. If you don't have quality in the process, we know what is going to happen. Dropout, insignificant learning, and so much other things. Then they have to consider quality, inclusion, and equity, and promoting lifelong learning as well. So they design an action framework in order to accomplish goal number 4 in the next 12 years. I'm speaking from the UNESCO. What does this mean to promote lifelong learning opportunities for all? How can you do this in specific? Well, we have to speak in English because we don't know how to do it. We have to discover together how to do it. We know in international organisms how to review policies, how to do planning and monitoring. But what about implementation? Some people know, but it's not like the essence of the work for international organisms. However, this is our main subject. But Pedro is a great mentor for implementation, not only for designing policies, but for implementing them, because if things don't happen, then we are not going to witness any change at all. Goal 4 includes other goals. Universal school for primary, secondary, and preschool. This is the first time that the concept appears in the international agenda. Access to technical studies, opportunities for a decent work, equity, gender equity, inclusion, universal literacy for young people, and a proportional part also for adults.
So how many adults are we talking about, or what is a proportional part of adults? It's something that we will have to figure out. Education of citizens for sustainable development. I will be talking about 4.7, and then the targets has some verification mechanisms that have to do with efficient learning environments and grants for teachers. So at least there are 10 more exhaustive items than what we had before. But the question here is lifelong learning here? Is adult education included here? Well, yes, it partially, but only partially in both cases, and I am going to tell you why. There are 4 messages on the action framework, which is the document that allows for the implementation of goal number 4. And they are connected to lifelong learning. The first one says, all people, particularly those that are vulnerable, shall have access to an equitable, equal and quality education and lifelong learning opportunities. And lifelong learning shall be included in the educational systems through institutional policies and practices, including transsectoral approaches, which include family, employment, industrial and economic development, migration, and integration, and citizenship, and financial policy. So what I see here in number 2 is that the sectoral approaches to lifelong learning and their partnerships and cooperation make me think of 4 dimensions. First is that educational systems must adopt a holistic approach that involves all subsectors and levels. For example, we have a system that teaches us how to think on lifelong learning in preschool, in school, in elementary school, secondary school, tertiary school, higher education, adult education. How can we do that? Well, we have to consider a lifelong learning approach at every educational level, but also we have to transcend the educational sector and work jointly with other ministries. For example, what happens with health, environment, social development, labor, culture? What I mean is that we cannot just leave the educational process to the education ministry alone. So we have to have a cross-cutting sectoral approach in coordination with the different government levels. It is very interesting to see how the policies can be developed at the national level, and then that is not trickled down. The people responsible for the implementation are completely clueless as to what is going on at the local level. So it is a community, the city, the village that implement the policy. So we need to figure out how to coordinate the different sectors. In my doctoral thesis, I found that in Brazil, education was decentralized overnight in 5,800 municipalities. Can you imagine the disaster that brought about? All of a sudden, mayors were responsible for education, and they have budget to allocate to education. I mean, I don't even want to mention the corruption that brought about. But not being careful with the processes and not being careful with the monitoring of the processes dooms implementation to failure. So I don't know what happens in Mexico, but I think that something similar is the case. Well, from the little I know it is the case. And the other thing is the interactions with the social stakeholders. So this is not only an issue of the government. We have a common core with the academia, with NGOs, with the public sector. Definitely with NGOs, and that is something that we have seen for many, many years now. NGOs have been able to actually pinpoint what are the specific problems that are lacking public policy. So how do we bring all stakeholders together around a table to discuss about the topic? So these are the 4 dimensions of the SDG number 4 action framework. It requires the reiteration of learning in flexible point at flexible points and in different stages, and we have to strengthen the links between formal and informal education and reinforce knowledge, previous knowledge that has been acquired formally and informally. So what does this mean? Well, this means that we have a very rigid, stringent formal system that very hardly accepts that learning also occurs in other spaces. And the processes are just as efficient as formal processes. So how do we build bridges between formal and informal processes? With the regional or national qualification frameworks, we are trying to build those bridges, as Aaron said yesterday. So we have technical and vocational education. How can we just match that with a formal education? And then there's a third item, which is the recognition of acquired knowledge that is becoming policy in different parts of the world. So those are things that you have learned during your life, and now they have to be recognized and validated. So you have this problem in Europe with refugees and people who have been fully trained in their countries, and they are very capable and very qualified. And, for example, they come into Germany, and they have the sheer idea of having to think of doing a 3-year course is something that they are completely reluctant to. And now they have to speed it up in Germany. And what about the peace process in Colombia? How do you bring those people into society with all their knowledge? They know about green tourism. They know about leadership. They know about community economy, things that they have developed, knowledge that they have developed, and how can we efficiently bring them into the society? So the more permeable the systems are, then you will, the easier you will allow to recognizing life knowledge or lifelong knowledge. I worked with Portugal in this practice. And the more we think and the better we develop these systems, then the stronger our educational systems will become as well. And finally, information and communication technologies will have to be strengthened to be used with educational systems and guarantee effective learning and a more effective service provision. Evidently, they have changed the world of learning. ICTs are revolutionizing the world of learning. And we are not sure what it implies yet. Certainly, it will also widen the gaps. But I think that we still have much to rethink about continuing education in universities. So ICTs are not only a tool to get more funds or more money or to collect more money in tuitions, but now it is a way to facilitate new possibilities to society at large. So we have 4 very valuable messages, but I still have a few queries that I would like to share with you. I do believe that the critical role of LLL for the 17th SDGs It's not quite yet. So we have the goal. The goal is to promote lifelong learning. But the 10 targets mention nothing about lifelong learning. In fact, they are just revolving around the formal system. So we're going back to year 2000. The best goal, if I may say that, a target that is 4.7, because 4.7 is the one that allows talking about non-educational environments. It speaks about education for sustainable development, education for global citizenship, education for peace. It speaks about health, and in one way or another, this one will gear us with the other 17 goals that reflect upon these issues that I have already mentioned. But when one looks at 4.7 and their indicators, it's only formal education. So how are our people supposed to understand citizenship and sustainable development and culture of peace if it only happens, or if it is only contemplated to be happening at schools and not within a community? So I have to confess that the people at UNESCO who work on education for sustainable development, with a huge support from Japan, say we are tired of working at the national level, because if we don't work at the city level or at the village level with people on the field, change will just not occur, and we will just remain stagnant as we did in the last 15 years. Number 2, flexible ways of learning and recognition are not considered in any of the 7 targets or the 3 means of implementation. So if we intend to have a flexible system, it is just words, because it is not actually incorporated into any other targets, and much less so in the indicators. So you have the targets and then the 48 indicators, and none of them even mentions lifelong learning. So again, that lifelong learning notion goes back to what it was originally, just philosophy, just an organizational principle that has no strength or no momentum to actually impact reality. So maybe it should just remain as such, and maybe not be highlighted or enhanced as much as I want. But I want to tell you how lifelong learning can get into practice. Because I believe that in the end, countries are not just passive recipient of global agendas and international guidelines. One can meet as many times as we want, but cities and villages are going through learning processes whether we like it or not. And even if our rulers signed the declaration, and even if it does not trickle down, things are still happening, and they don't necessarily move bottom up. Relevant policies and strategies in 2 countries like Norway and Korea show 2 different approaches that can be very helpful. I mean, I am not bringing you just an example of how good they are and benchmark us with them and tell us how bad we are at it. No, I am just going to show you an example, because there are many things that we are already doing, and there are many other things that we don't even have an idea of how to do. Each country will do the things at the right time for that country. I think that the Nordic proposal, that is, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and even Iceland, I mean, they have this lifelong learning concept of the year 2000, and then they are calling for discussions at the whole European level to talk about what lifelong learning means in the private and public life. So there's a huge public debate, and in 2001, they even proposed some indicators that, ironically, I mean, the concept was so broad. And when you look at the indicators, indicators are just for adult education. So this broad vision actually went back to taking an adult as the center. They took the Treaty of Lisbon and their goal to make Europe the most competitive and dynamic region of the world that was capable of having sustainable growth with more employment and greater social cohesion. And with this, in 2007, Norway launched its strategy for the implementation of lifelong learning. And I used these two countries, but if you go to the Unesco's website, you'll be able to find a study that we made where we analyzed the policies across several countries to learn about those countries that had a lifelong learning vision. Some countries mentioned it openly, other countries did not name it per se, but actually had something about it. So we gathered all the policies together and we analyzed all those policies together. And in the 2007 strategy, Norway said that lifelong learning was linked to adult education. However, the strategy shifted because it shifted to include all levels and all ages, and now it includes lifelong learning from childhood to later in life. And what is interesting about this strategy is that it looks more like a blueprint, like an outline to explain people what learning is about. They don't have any clear action points, but they are actually using only experiences that are already occurring in the country. And that was different because apparently this label of lifelong learning is used to things that we are already doing and that are already happening. So there's no new initiative, no new paradigm, because lifelong learning seems to be already a part of society. So the Norwegian Ministry of Education has given us this blueprint from basic education to doctoral education, and then or postgraduate education, and then we have education in early childhood, and then art and the sports, science, music, trade, senior adults, etc., and how each of these stages of life or aspects of life link to the formal educational system, and then it becomes part of the process. Because this is how it has been. This is something that they just did not think of their own goal in 2007. It just came about. It has had its pros and cons, but this is how it has been. It is a comprehensive concept of lifelong learning, which very much aligns with what international organizations propose. And the same thing happens with Denmark and Finland. But then we have another different framework in Korea. Well, he's apologizing for the English slide for Spanish speakers. But here we see that there is a breaking point. In the 1980s, Korea decided to include the concept of lifelong education. I remember, this is why I did not translate it, because they don't call it lifelong learning, but they call it lifelong education. The thing is that lifelong education, in a way, comprises or is used instead of adult education. And it is contemplated and included and provided for in the Constitution. But then in the 1990s, they brought a new educational framework where they referred to lifelong education again. And then they added a third item, which is the Lifelong Education Act, that promotes the creation of the National Institute for Lifelong Education, and then they have local institutes as well. That sounds like some familiar scheme, right? So from the different levels of government, different things have been done. So far, it might not sound that interesting, but what is very important to me is that the policy and the strategies are designed at the national level, but the implementation is run at the local level. So it is at the local government that implements the projects, and they create a city, municipal, province implementation that is very sound and very strong. A wonderful, wonderful implementation program. So the policy is made at the institutional level, but it is the local government that makes the implementation. So in 2003, they launched lifelong educational cities. So every city that implements lifelong learning or lifelong education have to meet 10 requirements from the institution. And because Koreans love competition, then they are given an award as learning city, and they are giving extra budget for promotion. So actually mayors work for that implementation, and they have wonderful programs because they do it, because because the system is so complex. It could not be implemented at the national level, but it can be implemented at the local level. So you have NGOs, the academia, and the different stakeholders sitting together, and they talk about a lifelong learning policy for the city, and then they do it. Today, more than 150 Korean cities are learning cities, and the way in which they implement lifelong learning is through the city or through their community. You know that they have a lot of influence of Confucian philosophy and community learning. So they actually are strengthened by their communities and the community learning centers. And then there's another department for adult education engaged in vocational and technical education. And they have a different framework, legal framework for that. And now they are trying to merge them together. But because the system is so well geared, then they might be able to do it in a short period of time. So this is a different concept of lifelong learning that appeals more to adult education as we know it. And it allows us to see that in Latin America we are not that far away from this. So, based on the different messages in the action framework and lifelong learning definition, I am now going to compare both countries. I think governance is very important, but we also have to include other topics before, like education levels, modes of learning purposes, diversity of learners, flexibility of means of learning. So if we take all these categories, then I'm going to show you a table. So what happens with educational levels in Norway? They have included all levels, including technical and professional education and adult education. What happens in Korea? In Korea, they are extracurricular activities for adults of 18 years of age and more. What happens with learning modes? Norway includes everything, but in the case of Korea, they take non-formal and informal learning. And I particularly think that informal education does not exist. I think that there is informal learning, but there is no educational structure or informal educational structure. Then we have the purpose of the learning is the development of democracy and the social and working life. And in the case of Korea, they intend people to develop their potential to be happy, focused on the economic benefits brought about by developing activities. So I don't know if you have heard this strain between the humanistic side of things and the economic side of things. And to me, that does not make sense anymore. I mean, you cannot just make a person break into silos. And there are some skills that will help somebody develop better family skills or financial skills. But in one way or another, they are all operating at the same time.
Flexible learning arrangements that fulfill the needs of all people, including the specific needs of an indigenous population. In Korea, quality and opportunities for lifelong learning based on free participation and voluntary learning. I think that in this concept, it's very important that everything is based on the grassroots, is based on the needs of the people. And building upon what Helen was saying yesterday, people, for example, is willing to learn things that they decide to learn. They are not imposed by the government. In the case of Korea, there is a quota that they feel that they need to pay for it because adults and elderly people, they are the main heroes for the country to have an economic development. So they owe them. There is a debt with these people. But not necessarily they complete basic studies. They learn about culture, traditions, and other matters. And I think that this has given them a great social cohesion. And they have to generate flexible programs. Both countries are proposing a national framework for education. In Korea, you have a credit bank. You accumulate credits at a formal level, and they are developing a system for recognition and validation. And I think that this is in their first stages. for governance. If it's intersectorial, the policy is going to be coordinated by the International Affairs Department based in the strategy with the framework of the European Union. It's not a robust structure. Different actors are included. Basically, NGOs are focusing on adult education, but in a free manner. In Korea, the implementation system is very robust, based in local and national institutions with periodical systems. In the national system is every 5 years. In the local system is every 2 years. The mayors are chosen according to these policies. And now we are in the candidates' campaigns, right? So we have to take that into account. What can we do? There are different ways to implement lifelong learning, and I don't have a preference, because I think that it depends on the context. And there are some contexts that have to be underscored. In the Nordic countries, they have comprehensive systems for all the 8 stages of the educational system, for all sectors, for all ages, creating links among different learnings of level to ensure opening, flexibility of educational ways. And there are other countries in which is independent and they supplement. It's focused in specific stages of the area, mainly in adult education, learning modalities, policies focus on formal and informal learning for adults. Asia Pacific and Asian Southeast, Singapore, Indonesia, Laos, Cambodia, and so forth. And I didn't want to put our countries there because it's very controversial, but I think that some of our Latin American countries can be included in that category. Community learning processes are there based on supplementary techniques, even though when the term is not present in policies. In Arabian countries, in African countries, and in some Latin American countries, we can see that it's embedded as well. I don't know if I have to put a conclusion here, because I don't think that we have yet a final conclusion. This is a field of work that demands a lot of practice, a lot of cases. We need to keep on working on different cases to facilitate processes for decision makers. So lifelong learning become an affordable, accessible term that can show immediate advantages. But let's say something about that. Modern educational systems should adopt an approach for lifelong learning. That doesn't mean that you are going to design the policy for lifelong learning. In many African countries, this is happening. However, it's just a copycat of what they did in Europe. And I think this is not as successful as knowing that the policies that have been implemented have this concept of learning embedded in them, beyond the concept of education. Of course, I'm not trying to put this term into conflict, because we know that there are a lot of educational systems with learning and others without learning. So it's just about having a solid basis with a robust learning. And the learning process should go beyond the school. a legal framework with policies and plans for lifelong learning processes are necessary if you want to have a change. I mean, maybe you don't need to have a policy for lifelong learning, but how are you considering strategies? It's just about a matter of not dropping out. It's just about completing another subject matter, and you are not going to have to study more. People like to study. We like to study. We all love to study. This is not just a quality of Asian people. Come on. The experience that I have seen in other countries is amazing. You offer classes that are interesting for people, and it's going to be packed. It's going to be booked, but you have to become this a policy. Non-formal learning is going to be done not only through non-formal education, it's going to be a cross-cutting subject matter for education and other sectors. And this is a paradigm, this is a new way, because it goes beyond the educational system or the Ministry of Education. Well, at a national level, where we have a lot of groups of powers, considering the fact that this could go beyond that, requires a lot of work. Promoting lifelong learning efforts requires the commitment of different associations, organizations, and agencies of the government. It requires a coherent approach from the government and an allocation of resources. I am a firm believer that if we are able to allocate resources at different levels, things can happen. And that's it. Thank you so much.